everybody, I hope you guys are having a wonderful day. In this video, we're going to talk about how to use Copeland's method to determine the winner of a preference schedule vote. So take 3 deep breaths and let's make this math easy. All right, so the idea of Copeland's method is even if you have 3 or 4 or 5 or however many choices, you're going to look at each pair of choices and see out of that pair which one of the candidates will win. So in this example, we have 3 different candidates and we want to compare each pair of candidates. And so the first step is to list out what all of the pairs are. So our first pair we could say is L versus Dawn. And then our next pair would be L versus Key. And then we would have Dawn versus Key. So these are the 3 possible pairs of candidates. And so we're going to look at each pair and see which one of the 2 candidates in that pair would win the election if it was just a 2-way election. So when we look at this and we say, okay, L versus Dawn, essentially we're going to ignore all of the places where Key is at in the preference schedule. So if we look at it, it looks like L would be the first choice for the 342 people that voted in that column. Dawn would be the first choice for the 214 people, and Dawn would be the first choice for the 298 people as well. And so if you add up all of L's points, you get 342. If you add up all of Dawn's points, you're going to get 512. And so that means that Dawn is going to win that election. Then you would do the same thing for L versus Key. And you would say, okay, well, L is going to get these points. Key will get these points. And Key will also get these points. And so in L versus Key, L would get 342 again, and Key would get 512, which means that Key wins that election. And then in Dawn versus Key, we would say Dawn is going to get the 342 votes as well as the 214 votes, and Key would get the 298 votes. And so Key would get 298, and to find Dawn's votes, we'll do 342 plus 214, and that tells us that Dawn's amount is 556, and so Dawn would be the winner in that case. And so the way that you determine the overall winner is you list out points for each candidate depending on how many of the pairwise comparisons they won. So we have 3 candidates, L, Dawn, and Key. And L did not win any of the pairwise comparisons, so her score is going to be 0. Dawn won 2 of them, so his score is going to be 2, and Key won 1 of them, and so his score will be 1. And so that means the overall winner of Copeland's method would be Dawn. And by the way, it is possible for a pairwise comparison to be a tie, like if they both have the same number of votes. And if that happens, then you give each of them a half of a point. So that's the basic strategy of Copeland's method. So why don't you try this one on your own and determine based on this preference schedule where people voted for their favorite types of shoes, which type of shoe would be the winner via Copeland's method. So pause this video and then restart it to see how I would solve it. Okay, so the first thing to do is we need to list out all of the possible pairs. So I recommend doing this very methodically. So I'm going to start with sneakers and I'm going to list all of the possible things that I could pair with sneakers. So I could do sneakers versus flip-flops, and I could do sneakers versus boots. Then I'll move on to my next type of shoe and I'll say, okay, let's take flip-flops. Well, I've already got a pair that represents sneakers versus flip-flops, so I don't need to write that one again, but I do need to do flip-flops versus boots. Then I'll use my last type of shoe, which is boots, and make sure that I have all of the pairs that could involve boots. So I have boots versus sneakers and boots versus flip-flops. Both of those are already written down. And so this represents all of the possible pairs of types of shoes. Then I'm going to go through and calculate for each pair how many points each type of shoe would have. So if I'm doing sneakers versus flip-flops, sneakers are going to win these 5 points as well as these 3. Flip-flops will get these 7 and this 1 point. Sneakers will win these 6 points and flip-flops will win these 4 points. So sneakers has a total of 5 plus 3 plus 6 points, which is a total of 14 points. And then flip-flops has a total of 7 plus 1 plus 4, and that would be a total of 12 points. And so that means that sneakers won that pairwise comparison. Then I'll do sneakers versus boots. So sneakers are going to win these 5 votes, these 3 votes, and these 7 votes. And then boots are going to win this vote, these 6 votes, and these 4 votes. And so the total number of votes for sneakers would be 15 because 5 plus 3 plus 7 is 15. And then the boots are going to be 1 plus 6 plus 4, which is 11. And so sneakers won that pairwise comparison as well. And then my last pairwise comparison, if I do flip-flops versus boots, flip-flops will get these 5 votes, boots will get these 3, flip-flops will get these 7 and this 1 vote, and then boots will get these 6 votes and these 4 votes. And so if I add up the number of votes that flip-flops get, I would have 5 plus 7 plus 1, which is a total of 13. And then if I add up the points for boots, I would get 3 plus 6 plus 4, which would be a total of 13 as well. And so in this case, they are both winners, which means they'll both get half of a point. So if I write out the points for flip-flops and sneakers and boots, then flip-flops won a half of a pairwise comparison, so its score is going to be 0.5. Sneakers won 2 of the pairwise comparisons, so its score will be 2. And then boots won a half of a pairwise comparison, and so the boots score will be 0.5. And so overall, sneakers got the most amount of points, and so the sneakers would be the favorite shoes by Copeland's method. So the most important thing when you're doing Copeland's method is to make sure that you write down all of the possible pairs. So the last 2 examples have involved 3 choices, and I want to show you how to list all of the pairs if you have 4 or 5 choices. So let's say you were looking at this preference schedule for people's favorite thing to do in their free time. And so if you wanted to list out all of the possible pairs, it's best if you do it very methodically. So I might say, okay, I know that I could do TV versus sleeping. I could do TV versus reading a book, or I could do TV versus exercising. And those are all of the possible pairs that involve TV. Then I'll want to do the same thing for the next activity. So I'll say, okay, well, I've already got sleeping versus TV because that was listed here. So I can do sleeping versus reading a book and sleeping versus exercising. And those are 2 new pairs that I haven't done before. And then I'll move on to my next one and I'll say, okay, well, my next activity is reading a book. Well, I already have TV versus book as well as sleeping versus book. And so I'm going to do book versus exercise because that's the only one that I haven't written down yet. And then I'll go to my next activity, which is exercising. And I've already done TV versus exercising, sleeping versus exercising, and reading a book versus exercising. And so all of the exercising pairs have already been listed. And so through that methodical process, I've listed all 6 possible pairs of what I can compare for Copeland's method. And I'm not going to go through and calculate which one would win in each case, but in order to do Copeland's method, you have to make sure that you list all of the pairs. So I wanted to do an example of how to list the pairs for a larger number of options. So let me do that really quick for this one as well. So let's say we had 5 choices to choose between if we were listing our favorite drinks. If we wanted to list all of the possible pairs, you could do this methodically by saying, okay, well, I could do coffee versus soda, or coffee versus juice, or coffee versus water, or coffee versus tea. And those would be all of the pairs that involve coffee. Then I could say, okay, well, I've already got soda versus coffee, but I could also do soda versus juice, or soda versus water, or soda versus tea. And those would be all of the pairs that involve soda. Then I could move on to juice, and I could say, well, I already have coffee versus juice, as well as soda versus juice, but I could still list juice versus water and juice versus tea. And so that would be all of the pairs that involve juice. Then I could move on to water, and I could say, well, I already have coffee versus water and soda versus water and juice versus water, but I don't have water versus tea yet. And so I would list that. And then once I get to tea, it looks like I've already listed everything because I have coffee versus tea and soda versus tea and juice versus tea and water versus tea. And so these 10 pairs would list all of the possible pairs of these 5 options. So remember, with Copeland's method, your first step is to list all of the possible pairs, and then you go through and find the winner of each pair, and then you add up the scores for each of your choices depending on how many pairs that choice won. And if you get a tie in one of the pairs, then each of the 2 options gets a half a point. So that's how you use Copeland's method, and I hope you guys have a good day.